Hey, welcome to the Wayfarer Podcast. This is episode 7. Can you believe that? We've got 7 episodes as of tonight. I always get that wrong when my wife asks me about our anniversary, and I say, is it the year that I get to say it's our 20th anniversary? Are we entering our 20th anniversary? Tonight is our 7th episode. So we have 6 in the bag. 7 is tonight. And tonight's a special episode because we have a guest with us. This is Mike Sherrard. Mike Sherrard is president of Apologetics, Inc., a cultural apologetics ministry that exists to make disciples and show the world the truth, goodness, and beauty of Jesus Christ. Before joining Apologetics, Inc., Mike pastored Crosspoint Community Church in a place that seems made up. It's called Peachtree City, Georgia. He was there for over 10 years. He's an international speaker specializing in worldview, ethics, and apologetics. He's appeared on television and radio programs such as Fox and Friends, Moody Radio, and also works regularly with Life Training Institute and Summit Ministries. I could go on and on. Mike's got his BA in religion and Masters of Divinity with a concentration in apologetics from Luther Rice, and is working on his PhD in apologetics at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. Before we turn it over to Mike and pepper him with questions, we just want to say welcome, Mike. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a joy to be among friends.
Yeah. You're going to earn that friend spot. Down at the end, I got to introduce our cast. This is...
I'm Riley.
Next to Riley.
Katia.
Jared.
And Jonathan.
All right. Well, thanks for being here again, Mike. Before we dive into the Q&A, tell us a little bit about Apologetics, Inc., the work that you do, the organization. We heard about why it exists, but for you leading that organization, give us some context about the work that you and your team are doing.
Yeah, I think there's really good reasons to believe that God exists, that Jesus is his son, that he died on the cross and rose from the grave, and in Jesus Christ there is abundant life. I think Christianity offers the best explanation for the nature of reality, and it leads to human flourishing when we follow the teachings of Jesus. And I'm tired of meeting young adults who after a lecture say something like, "Why hasn't anybody ever told me this?" So there's an entire generation that have real, meaningful, honest questions, and they need someone to give them an honest answer. Now, there's a lot I don't know. There's a lot that is mysterious, and I don't want to present this, that all these questions are so stupid. Why don't you have an answer for them yet? No, but there are people that have meaningful questions, and they need someone where they can raise their hand and say, "Hey, help me out with this." And someone says, "Man, that's a great question. I struggle with that too. I've wrestled with that too. I totally get you. I know why that's important." And they need an answer. And so I don't know if that's the best way or not to put it, but that's kind of what motivates me in our group is we want to give honest answers to real questions, help an entire generation on their quest to understand what is the nature of ultimate reality and find the abundant life therein.
Yeah, I love it. That's the honest answers to honest questions. Deep back in our story was the inspiration of Francis Schaeffer, who founded L'Abri, for that very purpose. At another time in history, in American cultural context, people asking really serious, honest questions. And the church wasn't necessarily, at that time, open to them. And Francis Schaeffer created a space and said there needs to be a place.
Yeah, a lot. And I'll be careful not to get too much on a soapbox and too much church bashing or whatnot. But a lot of church feels like just training to be better at church, not really getting answers to real questions and then being able to apply them to your life and follow Jesus and love other people. So that's kind of what we're about, is we want to help people to really know what's real and live out that reality for the glory of God and the good of other people.
I love it. Well, that's what tonight is about. The Wayfarer Podcast, we set out to say we want to create space to have this conversation. We don't certainly have it all figured out or even a part of it figured out, but we said we want to do what people have been doing for thousands of years, intersecting with the person of Jesus. And there's something about his person and his authority and the goodness and the truth and the beauty that was embodied in the person of Jesus. And he literally would say, "Come follow me." And it was an invitation not to have all the answers ahead of time, but to trust that there were answers and that it was possible to see something so beautiful and mysterious unfold over time that slowly and surely, little by little, your life would be transformed and you would experience human flourishing both here and now and have hope for what is beyond. So that's the journey that we're on. And tonight we said we want to pause with somebody else walking that same road that maybe is a little bit further ahead and has spent time with others in that context, and just ask you the real questions. So some of the questions that we're going to ask tonight are ours. They're the questions that we wrestle with. Some of these questions, we reached out to some friends and people close to us and said, if there were an opportunity to have a space like this, what would you want to ask? What would you want to get answers to? So we're going to spend some time just dialoguing back and forth. Format's going to be questions, a little bit of follow-up, and then we'll keep moving through, and then we'll do a little Q&A afterwards. So Riley, I want to go across to you and let you ask the first question tonight. And just dive in. We've got a list of them, and I'll move us through. But Riley, take it away.
I don't like that smirk.
He's prepping.
Let's move to the next question.
I don't like being first either. I'm still getting used to being in front of a camera. I'm usually behind the camera, so being in front is uncomfortable for me. But first, before I go to my question, I just wanted to say, I don't know if we're lucky that our first guest on the Wayfarer podcast is you, or if you're lucky that you're our first guest on the podcast.
That's right.
But we're
We'll
glad
find
that
out.
it's going to be fun.
There's going to be a lot of clips of apologist owns local podcasts asking dumb questions.
That's the headline.
Okay, I'm going to go to my question. So, the idea of a supernatural world doesn't seem reasonable. How would you approach a conversation with someone who says, I believe in logic and reason? There's no way I could believe that pigs were possessed by demons and jumped off a cliff.
That's a funny question. I like that. Well, I don't know that, like, when you think about was it the supernatural or was it a spiritual world? What was
Supernatural.
Supernatural. Well, I don't think it's really that far-fetched to think about a world that goes beyond the material world. So I'm curious on what the word supernatural means. I guess I'm going to take it to mean that there exists, like, that the nature of reality is such that there's the material world and that there's an immaterial world. And that goes beyond the material world may include something like the supernatural, because it's just beyond the reach of what we can observe here in the natural world. I don't think it's that far-fetched. And I mean, what I'm really interested in right now, I'm really curious about this. So sorry if this is kind of a meandering way. I'm not stalling to answer your question.
Sure.
But we were actually talking a bit about this in the not the green room, whatever, the downstairs basement that smelled like something. We'll call it the green room. Jordan Peterson, for example, is really trying to get an answer to what justifies belief in the transcendent, something that goes beyond. And for Peterson, he thinks it's essential that there is some transcendent realm. Otherwise, you lack a justification for meaning and value. And he comes from a long line of thinkers that did see this. Nietzsche saw this, for example. Now, Nietzsche went the route of saying, no, there is no supernatural realm. There is nothing beyond the material world. God does not exist. And because God does not exist, there is no such thing as telos. That means there's no true design. There's no true purpose. Everything is the result of a cosmic accident. Therefore, one of Nietzsche's conclusions was that morality is, all forms of morality are just power plays. And we need to just give up on it. The Enlightenment project failed to justify ethics rationally. Let's get rid of it. It's now time for the Übermensch, the Superman, to arise. And the defining characteristic of Nietzsche's Superman is that he wouldn't look anywhere else outside of him for meaning and purpose and value. He would be able to create tables of value for himself within. That creates some problems, though. And for all of Nietzsche's insight, and one of the things I admire about him was his intellectual honesty, he would regularly mock and ridicule atheists for their lack of foresight. He would be in agreement with them that, yeah, God doesn't exist, but then he would mock them how they would keep operating under the principles of Christianity while dancing, so to speak, on God's grave. Because here's the problem. It's not that easy to construct meaning and value out of nothing. It's really not, despite what some atheist counterparts might want to claim. And so Nietzsche predicted that this would come at a pretty big cost to civilization. And he foresaw a very bloody 20th century, which of course did happen. So I don't think it's that far-fetched to believe in something beyond. I actually think most people do operate that way. They believe that there is something beyond us that is objective in nature that provides a firm justification for belief in meaning and value. And just an example of this would be when it comes to the existence and the notion of evil. If we look at this world and perceive that something is wrong, and not wrong in the sense of like, I don't like that, like I don't like vanilla ice cream kind of way. Like, no. Doesn't matter what I think, feel, or what my preferences is. That is objectively wrong. How does the existence of objective moral facts and values come from a purely naturalistic world? So I don't think it's that far-fetched to believe that there exists a realm beyond the material world that interacts with the material world in a very meaningful way and provides a firm belief and a grounding in some of the things that we all kind of take for granted, the existence, well, that there's real meaning and real value.
Brief follow-up, if I'm allowed. So what about, like in my situation, I feel like most of my friends are at that point too, where they would say, yeah, I believe there's something. If it's God, I don't know if it's God. It might be. I'm leaning more towards God. Like I believe he's there. There's a supernatural, and he's the God. Like there's all of this, and it's him. But when I read the Bible and I read about these miracles and like Jesus healing blind people and all of that, and I'm like, do I really believe that? That doesn't sound real. Like I've never seen something. I feel like in our day and age, that's something very like out of the ordinary. Like you wouldn't, as like compared to how we read about it and how like almost casual it is in the Gospels when you're reading all the miracles Jesus does. It feels very like it happens so much. But in today's culture, you feel like maybe it's just you don't see it, but maybe to the most common people, they're like, maybe that just doesn't happen anymore. So how would you kind of go forward with that when having a conversation with somebody?
Well, I'm happy to agree that miracles, just even by their definition, would be rare. And so it wouldn't be surprising to me that you might go your entire life and never witness one. It wouldn't even be surprising to me that an entire country or civilization could go for a meaningfully long period of time and never see them. If you accept the reliability of Scripture, I think that's also what you see. It's that it wasn't like miracles are just popping up all the time. They happened at specific periods in time of history for specific reasons, and some of those were to validate the message and the special revelation that was given from God. Because you asked this question, like if God exists and he wanted to make himself known to us, why should we ever believe that the revelation, the word that we're hearing is actually coming from God? Well, that might be a reason to allow for there to be miracles to validate the messenger. So I think I would agree that, yeah, they're uncommon. I think I would expect for them to be uncommon. But again, I don't think it's that hard to believe. If you're beginning from the framework of God exists and he was able to create all things, I don't think it's that far of a leap to then go, he could raise even somebody from the dead.
Yeah, no, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't get away without a book recommendation. If that provoked something, that idea, and that was, you resonate with that question of, something intuitively me says there's something beyond, but I want some evidence. Where can I look for evidence? Peter Berger wrote the book A Rumor of Angels, and it is a great book. That just says, why are there certain things in the natural world that seem to have a beyondness to them? And Berger approaches it really humbly. So thank you for that. I love that. Everybody expects me to go in order. I'm not. Jared, you're next.
Hey, yo, there it is. There it is.
See that?
Ladies last, right?
Yeah,
Gotta love it.
People from South Carolina always get preference.
Yeah, absolutely. South Carolina, born and raised. Hey, how can we trust, I think like around the Bible, like if we want to take the Bible for what it is, the reliability of that. I know there's a ton of documentations and copies of that, but even just thinking about the authors of it, how could we trust the biblical authors to properly write down and get everything correct when they are sinners, which we would say makes them fallen people?
Can I trust you in any way if you're a sinner?
Some.
So the fact that you are a sinner does not mean that trust is completely improper. So I think if you even want to just start from that standpoint, the biblical authors being sinners does not mean that they are going to be untrustworthy all the way through. Sure, they probably lie. They may be untrustworthy, but you don't start from a position of they must be untrustworthy and they must be lying. I don't think that's even a fair place to begin. You can begin with an assumption of, I'm going to take them at their word that they're telling the truth, and if I have good reason to believe otherwise, then I'll believe otherwise. And that does not preclude you. That's what I'm not saying is if someone tells you the truth, you just have to accept it and can't ask questions. But I don't think just the fact that somebody is a sinner, or even just let's take sinning out of the picture, finite beings, right? Man is finite. We're not infinite. So we are going to make mistakes even that aren't sinful. And I don't think a life of skepticism and mistrust has to follow because people are finite and sinners.
Sure. But as we're, basing our life a lot around the New Testament, with them being sinners, potentially getting things wrong in the Bible, how do we kind of vet through that and, ultimately get to trust? Could they, maybe not on purpose, but have gotten things wrong a lot of culture is being shaped by what we're looking at in the New Testament. So curious about how do we go through that? How do we not know that, maybe Mark is slightly wrong in some of the parables that he's telling us?
Yeah, I guess one of my questions would be wrong about what? So I do believe that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God, that it is infallible in terms of the original autographs that were written, not in terms of the process of copying them down. And I'm not talking about the scribal process that was involved in that. And I'm also not saying that our interpretation is infallible. But even though that's what I believe, I think that the Bible could be filled with mistakes. And yet, if it's right about its central claims, that's what's most important. So the question would be, for example, if you take the Gospel of Mark or whatever, and you might, even if you found really good reasons to believe Mark was wrong about how many angels were at the tomb. Okay, fair enough. Was Mark wrong about the resurrection of Jesus Christ? If he's not wrong about that, that's the detail that really matters. And so when it comes to something like inerrancy and is the Bible filled with mistakes, the real question is, what are those mistakes? And I don't think the Bible has to be infallible in order for us to have reasonable belief that God exists and that Jesus Christ is his son, and by faith in him we can have our sins forgiven.
So would you take that same stance around a lot of the Old Testament, potentially miracles or stories? I know C.S. Lewis, I think, thought a couple of the Old Testament books were stories rather than, actual literal history. Would you take the similar stance?
I would, and again, that's not my personal belief. I don't think that the Bible is filled with mistakes, but I will concede the ground that the Bible could be filled with mistakes, and that doesn't undermine the truth of Christianity, though.
Thank you.
Great question. Katya.
Oh, thanks, guys. Alrighty, my question. Considering the commonalities in spiritual practices across various religions, such as meditation in Buddhism, prayer in Christianity, and Islam, some argue that these practices are essentially different paths to the same universal truth. Why do you personally choose Christianity as your spiritual framework amidst these shared practices?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's true that there are a number of similarities amongst the world religions. But I don't think the similarities are what's really important. The differences make a bigger deal to me. So if you take the first part of that question, that the similarities are a kind of proof or evidence that all these religions are on the same path to God, I don't buy into that, because the differences make all the difference. Buddhism and Hinduism are highly philosophical religions, and I have a lot of respect for the depth of thought that goes into these religions. But their conception of reality is fundamentally different from the Christian one. Their conception of evil, fundamentally different than the Christian one. Their conception of God and his nature, fundamentally different than the Christian one. And those differences are so big that they greatly outweigh any similarities that you might find. So the differences to me are really what is what matters. And in these differences, which religion has the best justification for their beliefs or whatnot. And I think Christianity does, and that's becomes a really long potentially answer, and I won't be careful about getting too long-winded on that. But I didn't choose, in a sense, Christianity because it works for me. And in some, how do I want to put this? It's not just that Christianity works for me, it's Christianity is true and offers the best account of reality. I think it is the most internally coherent. There's no internal contradictions. And I think it also provides the best understanding of the world that we live in. And I think there are good reasons to believe that the claims that are made in Scripture and the very nature of how God is described in the Bible hold up to philosophy, to science, to history, and there are many good reasons to believe that Christianity is the correct religion, despite any similarities it might have with others.
Thank you. No follow-up question.
There you go, just done. Yeah. I think it's a great question, though. You know, we talk a lot about our culture and our moment being post-secular, post-Christian. And so I think a lot of the friends and family that we all have, we find similarity and commonality more now maybe than before, that people are looking up. And where they're looking, to Riley's point, like, I don't know what's out there, but I feel an instinct to pray. I feel a desire to meditate. And I almost hear Lewis's voice saying, friendship is born anytime you say, "Yo, you too?" Do you think that it's fair, safe to, in our territory now, in a kind of a post-Christian age, to have a little bit of a gentle and open, maybe generous posture as we meet people who say, "Oh, me too. I pray differently than you"? How do you navigate that? I mean, can you be friends and share something like that that has a commonality in practice, while the aim, you may fundamentally kind of differ on maybe ultimately where your prayers are directed? Would you feel like you can be comfortable and what guidance would you give us as we traffic in a lot of relationships where we can say, "Oh, you too"?
Yeah. No, I would say call them a sinner and run away from them.
Let's go.
No, I think I'm always, our world is so polarized right now, this country especially, right? It's hard to find. It seems like we don't have common ground with anybody on anything. Yeah. If you find common ground, cherish that, build a relationship off that, and pursue truth together off that. So, I'm real big. I'm really, one of my biggest talking points is that, an apologist, and sometimes I hate that niche kind of narrow, like, you're an apologist and you're not an apologist. I think to be a follower of Jesus Christ means being able to give a good reason for what you believe. So if I want to then just not use the phrase a good apologist, but a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, making the case for Christianity, asks way more questions than they make statements. And I think if you look at the example that Jesus set for us, and if you just read the Gospels just with an eye for how many questions Jesus asked. He has so many questions. Yeah. Why do you call me good? Who do you think proved to be the neighbor? I mean, just he asked question after question after question after question. So you find a friend and you find out they have a spiritual practice, ask them to tell you about it.
So good. I'm reading a book that David Brooks has written, and he talks about the power of asking the question, like, how did you arrive at that belief? What a beautiful thing. Like, hey, I practice, you pray, I meditate. How did you arrive at that? And starting with that. So thank you for that. Jonathan, you're up.
Yeah, we can definitely agree that the modern church, especially in America, is failing. And you see that with the numbers, the exodus of people leaving and meeting people that don't know who Jesus is, and they don't have an understanding of what it means to be a Christian. And that's sort of what this next generation has inherited. It's sort of a crumbling mess of what was the church. So how do you think we should start to, I don't know, do we just throw it out? Should we start to rebuild it? What should we aim towards? And do you have any challenges for us as far as maybe blind sides, because like a blind spot that we might face as we try to recover what we've lost?
When it comes to thinking about the church, I think it's important to remember fundamentally what it is. And the Bible uses a lot of imaginative language to describe the church. It uses imaginative language like family, that the people of God are like children, sons and daughters, members of a royal family. So it uses familial language. It does use political language. We're called citizens of heaven. We're called to be ambassadors for Christ. The word church in Greek, ekklesia, actually has it was used in a political sense in the first century, not even in a religious sense. And in Acts, you'll find ekklesia used in that way. The word ekklesia is used to refer to a group of people that gather, mostly citizens of a state who gather together to discuss affairs of the state. And so when Jesus says, upon this rock I'll build my ekklesia, the listeners in the first century would have had more of a political framework than a religious one, which is a really interesting thing. But so you have political imagery, you have family imagery, you have biological imagery, like flock and whatnot. So you have also the church is referred to as the bride of Christ. So within these imaginative concepts, you get a sense of the sacredness and how special the church is. And I think you need to start there and not start with our modern experience of something that is event-driven. I'm just curious, for the audience in person and online, when you hear the word church, what mental image pops into your mind? It's probably a building and it's probably an hour time slot. That's the wrong imaginative framework or conception of the church. It's not a biblical one, not fully anyways. And so I think you start there, and then you're able to rightly value what the church is, which is the right frame of mind to be in when you're going to critically reflect on our practices today. And I think things like having an event center, an event-driven church is unhelpful, and it's unhelpful at the least. So I think thinking through the different imaginative kind of categories or pictures, if you will, of the church, and then reflecting on our common experiences today is kind of a starting point to evaluate some of our practices. Is there anything inherently wrong about gathering once a week for an hour where you have somebody gifted in giving public lectures, speeches, sermons, gifted in public speaking, and musicians that are good? Is there anything inherently wrong in that? No. Is there something about that practice that conditions people to view church as an event they attend rather than something they're a part of? Maybe. What might we need to do to either add to or take away to help? I mean, these are the kinds of questions we need to have, because I'm with you. We have this enchanted language, I don't even know if it's disenchanted. It's just that the conception of church today is something that I don't know why anybody would almost want to be a part of. But what the church is one of the most amazing things that has been given to us. It is such a gift that we ought to cherish and think well about what it means to live as the church, not just simply going to church, if that makes sense.
It's the people, not the building.
I think what's wonderful, Mike, I heard you talk about the church, and you have a high view of the church, and you looked at it through the lens Lewis's on bikes, in that idea of re-enchantment, and that something even as beautiful and as sacred as being the body of Christ over time can feel really disenchanted. And that doesn't mean that we are to no longer have bikes or to think well about the bike, but it's to maybe go back and return to that older, ancient, enchanted thing that says, no, let's dig to the foundation and see how beautiful this really is. And I appreciate that about your question, Jonathan. Just like what I see, why I think this podcast is so important, what Mike and I think you and I both see in our work is, I think that the generations below us are asking beautiful questions from a place of beautiful hunger and thirst and curiosity. And I think what's on the other side of that's going to be amazing. So thanks for that question. Katya, can I go back to you and again throw a curveball because you think I'm going there? I'm going there.
Okay. Alrighty. So we kind of did my second question. So okay, we're gonna jump. You know, it's funny. I actually kind of thought of a question as you were speaking, because I think modern day Christians they really do associate themselves with the building. Like I had a friend who literally was zooming too fast to go to church and got into a complete car accident. Like, that's how eager we are to get to these buildings. But I think nowadays, what do you think about when people say I'm a spiritual person and I'm not a religious person? Like, do you think that there's a fault in that? Like, do you know what I'm throwing
I think they
down?
misunderstand the nature of the word religion. As soon as you have any practices in your life that are connected to a spiritual outwork, you are by definition religious. So you just have to ask that person, well, what do you mean by religious? Do you have a certain conception of who God is and how you are to orient your life because of him? And then does your life have any behavior in line with that? You are now by default and by definition a religious person. You see what I'm saying? So if you ever find someone that says I'm spiritual but not religious, just ask them, well, what do you mean by religious? Because what it probably means is I believe that there is something beyond this world, but I don't think what I'm seeing here matches that. I don't think the behavior and the practices and the gatherings here match what I think and believe is really real. And that just creates a really open door to have really meaningful conversations about the fundamental nature of reality, the existence of God, his nature, what it means to relate to him, and how we are to orient ourselves in the world because of that. But however we orient ourselves in the world because of what we think about God, that is religion by definition.
Because I think a big thing that I'm hearing a lot of is that whole concept of spirituality, and it's something that we can all agree on. We all agree on this instinctual questioning that we all have, and like we can all like relate, like you were saying. Like, it's really hard to find common ground nowadays. We can find common ground there, but it's like then there's this like umbrella that sprinkles into the different religions, and that's kind of where my question was rooted from. When you have like Buddhism, Hinduism, like all the isms that are going on right now, Christianity, and so I think it's hard to defend that. Like, it's hard to say, it's like you don't want to say you're wrong. Do you know what I mean? Like, how can you strip someone of their peace of where they find their own spirituality? Do you know? Like, they find peace there. So how could I, as a strong Christian, Catholic, look at someone and say, no, that's not right? It almost feels dehumanizing to look at someone and do that.
Yeah, I get that. But the other side of that is, if you look at someone who has a false peace because they've accepted a false reality, what's the advantage of that peace? I mean, it may be nice to live in that peace for a period of time, but at some point you're going to come up against what's really real. And I would have wanted somebody in my life to, with compassion, that it sounds like you have, with a high level of empathy, to have told me that the peace I'm experiencing will be short-lived because it's not rooted in something that's really real. So I think that's just the nature of friendship, right? I'm going to love you, and I'm going to love you even sacrificially. I'm going to love you so much that I'm going to risk our relationship. I'm going to love you so much, I'm going to risk your peace and my peace. If you've ever been in a fight with somebody, you know peace goes out the window. And peace is a blessing, and it is a gift, but it ought not be idolized in anybody's life as the highest good. So I think that's just a good friend is willing to risk, and a good friend, I think, often has the hope at least is your friend sees the pain that you're feeling even in that moment, and that you're not out to rob them of anything. Your hope is that they find abundant life.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Riley, I'm going your way.
What if I said the Bible is not evidence of anything? It's simply a book written by men. The book was clearly altered and edited through the years, and evidence suggests that it was written 100 years, hundreds of years even, after Jesus' death.
What's the question? I love how you ask questions.
What
If you said that?
Yeah, what if I was saying that and I believed that? Disclaimer, I don't believe that. I believe all of
Well,
it's
why
real.
don't you believe that then?
Oh, no.
Oh, crap.
This
I
is
just
supposed to be
turned.
on you, not me.
It's a one-way question asking.
This is a one-way question
Yeah, yeah.
street.
You did
You
that
ask
to
Round
us
me.
the
questions,
block.
we ask you questions.
You like threw a rhetorical at me, and I was really nervous. I was like, I'm not answering that. Do not throw a question
All
back
right.
at me.
I thought we were friends. We can't have fun
We
together.
can. We can.
All right. So what if you said that the Bible is just a book written by men that's clearly been edited, and what was the rest of it? Sorry.
And clearly edited and
written
then
much
after
later.
Jesus.
And so
Yeah.
the therefore is it shouldn't have any kind of authority in my life, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, I'd just work through some of those particular details. None of the books in the New Testament were written hundreds of years. They were written decades after, though. Galatians is probably the earliest of the books of the New Testament, and it's probably written the best, like the closest would be 30 years, but most would put it later. They would put it later, more like 40 or 50 years after the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But you do have, for example, within like the book of 1 Corinthians, you have evidence of early Christian creeds that probably date back to within a year of the resurrection of Jesus. The later dating of the books, it really isn't a problem in terms of their accuracy or their authenticity, and that's for a couple of reasons. You can bend down and pick those up. We all saw that
Live
fall.
TV.
We all saw that fall. And,
Thank you.
Sweaty hands over here. Come on, man.
That just buys me more time to, right?
Figure out an answer.
But one of the things that's really, to me, actually gives me more reason to believe that the New Testament is accurate is because of, well, a couple of things. One is the Jewish culture was an oral culture. You know, we live in a world where, you know, we're tech everywhere, digital, written language, digital language. More people in this country read than not. I mean, that's unique in terms of world history. Literacy rates have not always been like this. So, like a Jewish culture in the first century would be heavily an oral culture. That's why you would have things like creeds. Creeds are really important claims or ideas that have to be said in a way that's memorable so that you don't lose it. So it's almost hard to go back in time and imagine what it would like to be growing up in an era like that. There's like muscles in your brain, for example, that you would be using then that you're not now. I can't remember anybody's phone number, like only my wife. When I was a kid, I remembered I probably had 20 or 30 phone numbers memorized because I grew up in a time before the internet, before the smartphone. I'm an idiot with directions now. I grew up and I could get around town. Now I can't go anywhere without getting lost if I don't have GPS telling me where to go. So you can think part of our challenge here is to go back into that, immerse ourselves in what an oral culture would be like. The simple point being is that the teachings of Jesus were spreading before letters were written. And books of the New Testament were written. And this is why I have a higher confidence in the credibility of the New Testament, is because you already had a group of people that already knew what the teachings of Jesus were. So when you get a letter from Paul, and it is, if it were totally out of bounds, you'd be like, no. So the fact that these were written later really isn't a problem because the gospel was spreading through an oral culture that had the tools to understand, to memorize, and then to evaluate any letter or any book that was written subsequently. So from a date, that's just answering like kind of the dating question, and there was more to your question than that. But the way I would handle this, if we were, because we probably don't want to spend the rest of the night just on this, but the way that I would handle something like that is just, well, let's just work through each one of these things together, and let's see if your complaint, there's something to it. Let's get an answer to that and work through it kind of piece by piece. The good news is there's a lot of people that have done extensive work on this, and there's very good reason to trust that the Bible that we have today is accurate, authentic, and trustworthy, even though it was written by men.
I think what's so cool about that too, and Mike, you may know these dates, but as a book nerd, I love books, and I love when books were written and who wrote them. And the Christian texts, when we think about multiple sources within decades of a historical event, capturing that data, I think if you look at other sacred texts, I mean, there's some texts that are 800 years removed from the things that they're testifying to. And so you may have more on that. We can geek out on it later, but it's pretty cool when you look at what Christianity rests on, this oral tradition that when you're looking at sacred texts, how quickly in a non-printing press world we started to have written documentation. When you stack it up against other sacred texts, it's remarkable.
Even things like Alexander the Great, like historical things that we take absolutely 100% true. It's like there's a gap between when the written stuff lines up with that history.
It's pretty cool. You've got the mic, so go.
Oh my goodness, here I go. So this is a loaded one. So I'll just warn
A loaded question?
Loaded.
Right, because every other one has been real easy.
Real light softball. So the character of God, obviously throughout the Bible, I think a lot of people, when they look at the Christian God, look at things in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, thinking about how it can feel very exclusive, like Jesus is the only way to get through. Thinking about, like, is God good? And especially, I think, combining that kind of thought process and culture with my being raised in a Baptist church where God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and created all things, like how could free will live in that? And if free will's not there, then like he's created evil and like allowed for all these bad things to happen. And so I think that's obviously so many different things, but I think a lot of people get trapped and call that a playground of confusion that I've definitely spent some time at, of like, how do I make sense of all these different points that seem to question the character of God and really not make sense logically, to think that God didn't pretty much write a book of humanity and all the terrible things that go with it. And how could he do that if he's a good God?
Yeah, so within that, let's pull out maybe a piece of that, right? Because there's a lot. It's all under the broad category of the justice and the goodness of God. And you brought up a couple of things. Is there maybe one we could pull out all of them if you want, but is there one we could pull out and maybe look at that one first? That because you'd mentioned things like free will. I don't remember all the other things you had said, but is there one kind of piece in there that maybe we could pull out and just look at that first?
Yeah, let's look at just free will. Like, how could God be all-knowing and created all things? I think that's the thing. He could know and it still be free will, but the fact that he created every detail, how does free will even begin to fit into that?
Okay, so how does free will match with a conception of God that is all-knowing?
Yeah, all-knowing, all-powerful, and good. Because if there's no free will and God just ordained everything, then it seems like he is ordained to evil, which I would say is contradictory to him being all good.
Yeah. All right. So you'll hear a lot of times, if God knows all things, and tell me if I'm not catching the question the right way. If God knows all things, how could humans really be free? If God knows you're going to do something, then you have to do it, and how could you be free? Part of the answer to that is, and I would ask it back to you or whomever, what is there necessarily a causal relationship between knowing that something will happen and that thing happening? Just because you know something will happen, does that then cause the thing to happen, would be the question.
Yeah, and I would say no.
Right.
But the fact that he created everything, it's kind of like a domino set, that he set up all the pieces and he knows where they're going to go. And he also created every little detail and hit play on it, which I would say that's where I would always get confused and be like,
well, I don't think, the way you're putting it, I don't think that, unless you tell me if I'm misunderstanding you, sure. I don't think that the Lord created this world and then pressed play, and by play he means now the program that he designed is going to unfold, and that's going to include every human decision and action, right? Is that what you were saying?
Well, I feel like because he knows every little detail and he can foresee how all of it's going to play, every detail that he plays with and changes in the way that he's creating it allows him to also foresee how it's going to play out. So it's very interesting. How can he remove himself from the outcome while knowing if he's creating every little detail.
Yeah,
that goes in
well,
it.
there's going to be, okay, so within this big discussion of God's justice, things like free will, there are answers to some of these questions. I do think these are situated under a cloud of mystery, if you will. I think there's inevitably going to be some bits and pieces of mystery. For example, how does God relate to time? Is something that is a bit mysterious or just unknown. There's different theories of time. There's A theory, there's B theory. How does an immaterial, eternal being relate to a created world in a spatial and a temporal way? The Bible doesn't answer that. I mean, we get some insight, like he knows all things, but it doesn't explain how he knows all things, which is related to our theories of time, which inevitably are going to then cause questions about things like free will or whatever. So I get the confusion, and I think to some degree that confusion is going to persist because we are dealing with some crazy deep end of the swimming pool kind of topics here. And I think we should expect, when we're thinking about God, that there are inevitably going to be some things that are mysterious. I mean, you take something that we're getting pretty good at, science. There's still elements of science that are mysterious. Physics, quantum mechanics. I mean, there's elements here that are still mysterious. Well, if God exists, physics came from the mind of God. And if we can't figure out physics, are we fully going to figure out everything that it comes to the mind of God and how he interacts with the created world? So I hope this doesn't feel like a cop-out, because I think this is a truthful, serious answer that, generally speaking, but also in particular here, we ought to expect some bits and pieces of mystery when it comes to some of these topics. And that probably doesn't help you, though, does it?
No.
Jared, can I jump in and just ask, from my perspective, hearing that dialogue, I feel what Jared's feeling. And I'll ask it in a simpler way from my side, but just, I know in my own mind and in conversations, people going, okay, if God is a good God and he knew that bad thing was going to happen, isn't he responsible for creating something that he knew was going to lead to harm or evil, or he's culpable and he's responsible? So how can he be all good and have given, created something that inherently is going to have something against his nature?
Yeah. Can I walk through that? And maybe this gets even to some of what you're talking about. I think we got to walk through this a little bit slowly and make sure I'm clear and we're clear on some of these things.
Please walk through it slowly for me.
I'm glad you caught that I was directing that towards you and what I think about your intelligence.
Appreciate it.
He's very smart.
I think it's really clear to understand that evil is not a thing that God created. And we start there. The biblical text, of course, says that God created and what he created was good. Sin is not something that he created. Unpacking that a little bit more, we can investigate, well, what is the nature of sin? What is it? And this is kind of a classic position, but it's also a philosophical one, and that sin is what might be called a privation. Privation is something that does not exist in its own right. It only exists by virtue of something else existing and then something being removed from it. Does anybody have, no, you all have old money aesthetic clothes on. You don't have any jeans with holes in them. But if there was a hole in my jeans right now, that hole exists in a sense, right? But it only exists by virtue of something whole pre-existing it and then something being taken away from it.
Yeah.
And kind of a classic understanding of what sin is that it's a privation. Something must have existed first and then something taken away in a sense for it to exist. And if God created a good world filled with good things, one of them being human freedom, and then humans use that freedom to deviate from God's ways and his goodness, now we have sin. So God did not create sin, but here's where I would go, and this is where I feel like I'm being a heretic, but I guess on Wayfarer Podcast, heretics are welcome, right?
You're welcome.
Though I would say God did not create sin, in a sense, I think he's culpable or on the hook in a way. And let me unpack that to avoid now. I'm not pastoring a church, so I can't be run out. I guess I could be run out of my own organization, but let me.
They're watching too.
Let me.
This is your last time, so get it all out.
Committed now.
Let me unpack this a little bit more. So I'll never forget. I had a great home growing up. I mean, and I have a kind of family I wouldn't mind if we all lived on the same street, kind of thing. And some of the characteristics of our home were. We grew up playing sports, and it was a reading home. It was a home where you could ask any question, and there were a lot of spirited debates in love, and maybe sometimes just in pride. Like, am I going to let my brother get the best of me? Come on, heck no, right? But I remember this one conversation I had with my brother at the dinner table, and we were talking about the concept of original sin and God's justice and whether he's on the hook and all that kind of stuff. And I'll never forget my brother saying to me, he's like, I don't buy any of this. And my brother's a follower of Jesus Christ, and this isn't a story to tell, meant to imply anything about my brother, but he goes, I'm not buying any of this. You're telling me that a dad who left a loaded gun on the table, knowing what his kids would do with it, then walked away with it, can go, hey, not my fault. Not my fault. I think that's a fair point, right? Yeah. So in that sense, I think there's some way that God is on the hook, if you will. And I think the Bible talks about this in a couple of places. One is in Romans chapter 4, where it talks about why Jesus had to be put forward as a sacrifice for our sins, so that God would be just and the justifier of all who would place their faith in him. So I think this is where God created a good world, and it is such a gift that God would choose to make anything that could participate in an incommensurate joy, him, life itself, him. He knew that the way that would be meaningful and real is that humans would need to be free. He also knew what they would do with that freedom, and sin would emerge because of that. But he knew that he would pay the price for that by giving himself the being of incommensurate worth to atone and to pay for that, for those sins. And so I think when you take all of this together, plus with the future hope of the redemption and the restoration of all things, I think it's though we'll never be satisfied when we look at all of the pain in this world, at least there's a landing place, a restful place to some degree, a hopeful place, knowing that God still remains just. And it's not a fool for me to think that one day all the wrongs will be righted and the scales of justice will come out even.
That's a beautiful answer. I'm a beauty guy, and I love when you were talking and describing that there would be something so good, so true, so beautiful that is, and would allow freedom to be really free, even to the point knowing that a whole would be made and that something that would be less than would come about. But then the elegant and gracious gift to say, and I've made a way to make that whole again. It's just it's beautiful to the point of stunningly beautiful, ultimate beauty when you stand back and go, no way, that's beautiful. And I think that's where Tolkien and Lewis, it appears that this has been true. It's remarkable. Jonathan, we have time for one more in this. I think this is, Mike, why I'm so encouraged by Apologetics Inc., why I'm glad your organization exists in our moment and is doing the work, because I think we could all in the room and people watching go, we could do this forever, right?
Seriously.
So many good questions and so much opportunity to just dialogue like this and be honest and say the things that we wrestle with and do it in a way that goes, yeah, me too. And let's wrestle together and not without hope. So thank you for the work you're doing. Jonathan, why don't you ask, I want to give you a chance, one more, and then maybe we'll put a comma and say that we'll do this again. I think this might be a great start to dialogue that we just want to keep going.
There's a lot of pressure with the last question.
Yeah, drum roll, please.
It's got to be a good answer, too.
That's nice. Turn it right back. Nice.
So the God of the Old Testament is
Nope.
crazy, right?
No,
Wild,
no.
right?
That was. Let's end on the beautiful answer of the gospel.
New Testament.
But crazy wild, like sending hailstorms and ordering his people to leave no one alive, and there's this strict law. And then the God of the New Testament, I know it's the same God, but it seems like it changed. And with that, there was the vision on the rooftop of the law being, Christ didn't say it was broken, he came to fulfill it. So it's not really clear, like, do we need to follow the laws or not? Or so. And today, especially with the progressive movements that we live in, and where if you are against what someone might like, if you're against homosexuality or someone being transgender, that you're hateful. So how do we navigate that with knowing that God is love? Like why are some things hated and others not? And do we need to follow all the laws?
All right, so now you said, how do we navigate that? What is that in the question? Sorry.
That in the question is, how do we say that, like why is my sin different than yours? Or like why should we not have a gay pastor? Or why, like, should they be on our worship team? Like questions like that, where you're trying to say one sin is maybe different than another.
Yeah, that's a really good question. On something like this, that, when you're talking about sin, and inevitably that is going to be behaviors, there's going to be some behaviors that are going to be more personal to other people than others. So asking questions in a scenario like this is a very helpful way to go about it, because I think we can make a couple of distinctions. One is, Christians will always say all sin is equal. Okay, equal in what way would be an important question to ask. And the answer would be, all sin is equal in the sense that it separates us from a holy living God, and something must be done about that. So all sin, big or small, separates us from a holy living God, and there's a consequence and a cost associated with that. But then a fair question to ask after that would be, are all sins equal in terms of their impact or in other ways in the world that we live in? And the answer would be clearly no. Stealing $5 from somebody is not morally equivalent to killing somebody. Right? So all sin isn't equal in that sense. All sin is equal in the position that it puts us before God, but not all sin is equal in that way. So why might the Bible then, if this was part of your question, like maybe feels like it's singling out some sins over others? Well, part of the answer would be a social impact that is the result of that sin. That would be one reason. Another reason would be to consider the nature of the offense in terms of what it says to God. And let me be real careful with this, and this is the kind of question I don't like giving in a Q&A soundbite. I'd much rather have a conversation about this. So if there can be some grace on this answer, then that would be great. But when it comes to matters of sexuality, here's what I think is happening. If it is true that God created all things, and he, in creating all things, they thus have purpose, telos, design, a fair question to ask would be, is there design to our sexuality? I think it's a good, meaningful question that everybody has to consider. And then the next question would be, how fundamental is that? Like, is it like not that important that there's design to our sexuality, or how important is it to our sexuality? And if you're going to come at this from a biblical standpoint, the design to our sexuality is in the first 2 chapters of the Bible. It's a part of God's creative intent. When God made all things and unfolded this plan for how human beings were going to live in the world he created in relationship to him, male and female in marriage were right there central to the part of that plan. And so if we accept that our sexualities are designed by an all-knowing and loving God, and his design is for our well-being and the good of other people, what kind of offense is it to say to that creator God, It's almost like saying, F you. I will live how I choose. I think that's a bigger affront to the creator God than even something like lying is. Lying doesn't say kind of the same thing to God, right? And it doesn't, even in this sense, even have the same social impact. So I think when it comes to something like sexuality, that's one of the reasons why we see stronger language regarding that behavior in the Bible. It's for those reasons. But it does not mean that people that participate in that kind of sinful behavior are now less than. No, they're still on the same equal footing before the judgment seat of God. And I'm not now in that sense, superior to all these other people. So that kind of understanding, I think, guides us in how we are to engage these issues. We engage these people that are participating in sinful behavior by helping them to understand God's good design and his intent for us, and calling them to live a holy life, living out a holy sexuality because it honors God and it is good for the individual and even civilization when they follow God's plan for sexuality. But we do this by affirming their full dignity as image bearers of God and love them and treat them with respect and welcome them in a sense as we would any sinner.
Jonathan, thanks for asking again. These are the questions that I think go through all of our heads and hearts, and we wrestle with them privately and we wrestle with them publicly, and it's hard to do it because I think one of the things that I'm hopeful for is we're in a moment where I don't know that we in modernity have had a good lens on design. I think there's been so much.
It was killed in the Enlightenment. Sorry, you have the mic.
No, it's all right. It's so. If we want to talk about the Enlightenment and point to things, we'll go there. No, I think that my point is this. All of us are feeling the impacts, and I think everybody listening, the impacts of sexual sin in a really difficult uphill climb to go, does it matter? Is there purpose? Is there design? Is that meaningful? Do we have this conversation? It's been so not had in a healthy and helpful way, especially Enlightenment-driven conversations in the church with all of the things that have gone into that I think so many of us are going, man, I know what's within me and my sexual sin and proclivities and things like that, and now we're trying to make sense of it and look at this reference to a sacred text and go, it speaks of design, and there's something in me that longs for that, to have my body matter and to have my sexuality matter. But as soon as I say that, then I'm overwhelmed with the things that are true in my story, and then I don't even know if I can't make sense of my story. So I think I'm saying yes, thanks for asking that question, and for everybody listening going, man, those are the questions that are hard to wrestle through. And again, but we get to do it with hope and with generosity and with this aim to say maybe, and back to Nietzsche, and I'll leave it at this, but maybe the horizon hasn't been wiped completely. And he said, Nietzsche, what have we done? Who gave us the sponge to wipe the horizon? And he said, post-wiping the horizon, saying there is no objective design, there is no frame of reference for our sexuality, for our bodies. He said, if we do that, will we be not falling forward, backward, sideward, in all directions? And I think we feel that. I feel that. We feel that sexually as a culture. And I think, you look at from the 60s and the cultural revolutions forward, that's just continued to be the story. So there's great hope if we're willing to lean in and go, let's ask those questions. So Mike, thank you for being willing. Wayfarer Podcast, thanks for being willing. One of the things we said when we started this show is it's so risky, right? To come out and say, I got questions. I don't know all the answers. I'm wrestling with these things as a person of faith. And to do that together is just a very courageous thing. So Riley, thank you for your courage. Katya, thank you for your courage. Jared, Jonathan, I have a ton of respect.
And thank me for my courage.
I didn't say Jared. I think I did.
He said it.
I left it out. Hey, thanks for joining us. This is episode 7, right? So there'll be an episode 8 where I'll heavily lean on Jared's accolades. But until then, Mike Sherrard, thank you so much. We got to give it up for Mike. Thanks for joining us.